What if the most important thing a military commander could do was to avoid fighting altogether? That idea sits at the center of one of the most widely read texts in the history of human thought, a short treatise composed in ancient China more than 2,000 years ago that has never stopped being relevant. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
There is a thinker whose name is attached to a text so concise it can be read in an afternoon, yet whose ideas have shaped how generals, politicians, diplomats, and corporate strategists have thought about competition and conflict across 2.5 millennia. Tonight, we turn to a philosopher of strategy who argued that the highest form of victory is the one that requires no battle at all. The question before us is how a text born from the violence of ancient Chinese warfare became the most enduring guide to strategic thinking the world has ever produced.
The answer requires us to first understand the world in which that text was written, because the ideas it contains are inseparable from the specific historical pressures that made them necessary.
We are speaking about Sun Tzu.
Sun Tzu is the name attached to The Art of War, a treatise on military strategy composed in ancient China that reframed warfare not as a test of strength and courage, but as a discipline of calculation, preparation, and the careful management of advantage.
Then let us begin with the historical world that made such a text not only possible but necessary.
The text is traditionally attributed to a military strategist named Sun Wu, who is believed to have lived during the late spring and autumn period of Chinese history, roughly in the 5th century before the Common Era. This was a period of accelerating political fragmentation. The Zhou dynasty, which had once provided a nominal central authority over much of what is today northern and central China, was losing its capacity to govern, and the feudal states beneath it were growing in power and power. Ambition. The competition between these states was not occasional, it was continuous and existential. Kingdoms that failed to adapt militarily and politically did not simply lose territory.
So the intellectual environment was one in which thinking about strategy was not a theoretical exercise, it was a survival requirement.
Yes, and this is crucial to understanding what kind of text The Art of War is. It was not composed as philosophy for its own sake. It was practical thinking about how states could endure and prevail in conditions of perpetual threat. The spring and autumn period gave way to the Warring States period, which would last until the unification of China under the Qin dynasty in 221, before the Common Era. The Art of War was composed within the earlier part of this long arc of conflict. What made this era distinctive was not simply the frequency of war, but its changing character. Armies were growing larger, logistics were becoming more complex. The old model of ritualized aristocratic combat between small warrior elites was being replaced by mass infantry warfare, requiring new organizational and strategic thinking.
So, the scale and nature of warfare had changed in ways that old frameworks could not address.
Exactly. And into this environment came a body of thought that did not simply describe how to win battles, but asked a more fundamental question. What is the nature of strategic advantage, and how is it created before the fighting begins? Here, we must address the question that historians consistently raise. The identity of Sun Tzu as a historical figure is genuinely uncertain. The biography attached to him in later sources describes him as a military advisor to King Helu of the state of Wu, but the details are sparse and some are contested. Some scholars have argued that The Art of War is a composite text, assembled and refined over time by multiple contributors drawing on accumulated military experience, and that the figure of Sun Tzu is as much a literary construct as a historical individual.
So the popular image of a single sage setting down his wisdom may not reflect the actual origin of the text.
Yes, and this is one of the most important correctives to the way The Art of War is often presented. The discovery of a version of the text on bamboo strips at Yinquishan in 1972, dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era, confirmed its antiquity and provided new material for scholarly analysis. But the question of whether it represents the thought of a single individual or a tradition of strategic reflection accumulated over generations does not diminish the significance of its ideas. It may in fact enhance it, suggesting that its principles were repeatedly tested and refined against actual military experience.
So, the uncertainty about authorship is not a weakness in the text. It may be evidence that the ideas survived precisely because they worked.
Exactly. Now let us turn to the ideas themselves, because the content of The Art of War is frequently misrepresented, often reduced to a collection of memorable aphorisms about deception and aggression. The text opens with what is perhaps its most important claim, that war is a matter of vital importance to the state, a road to either safety or ruin, and that it must be studied with the utmost care. This framing is already a departure from celebratory or heroic traditions of military thinking. The art of war treats war as a problem to be solved with the minimum expenditure of resources, not a test of valor to be embraced.
So the very first move the text makes is to reframe warfare as a cost, not a glory.
Yes, and from that reframing, the entire logic of the treatise follows. If war is a cost, then the supreme achievement is to obtain your strategic objective while incurring the least possible cost. The highest form of strategy in Sun Tzu's framework is to defeat the enemy's plans before they are enacted. The next is to sever their alliances. The next is to attack their army in the field. And the least desirable option, used only when all else has failed, is to besiege their cities. This hierarchy places direct military confrontation at the bottom of the strategic spectrum, as a failure of preparation and intelligence rather than a demonstration of strength.
So a general who wins every battle is, by this logic, not the supreme strategist. The supreme strategist.
Exactly, and that inversion of the conventional military hierarchy is the conceptual core of the entire text. The practical mechanisms Sun Tzu proposes for achieving this kind of advantage fall into several interconnected categories. The first is intelligence and self-knowledge. The text argues that a commander who knows both the enemy and himself will not be endangered in 100 battles. A commander who knows himself but not the enemy will sometimes win, and sometimes be defeated. A commander who knows neither will be defeated in every battle.
So knowledge is not supplementary to strategy. It is the foundation of it.
Yes, and Sun Tzu is unusually specific about how that knowledge is to be obtained. The final chapter of the text is dedicated entirely to the use of intelligence agents, categorizing different types of spies by their position and function, and arguing that no investment in the conduct of war yields greater returns than investment in information. The second major category is deception. Sun Tzu presents deception not as dishonorable but as the essential operating principle of all effective strategy. All warfare, the text states, is based on deception. When capable, appear incapable. When active, appear inactive. When near, make the enemy believe you are far. When far, make them believe you are near.
So, the battlefield Sun Tzu describes is primarily a psychological space rather than a physical one, Yun.
Yes, the physical confrontation, if it occurs at all, is the culmination of a process that has already been decided in the minds of the commanders involved. A third major category is adaptability. Sun Tzu insists that there are no fixed tactics, just as there is no constant shape to water, which flows around obstacles and finds the lowest point without the obstacle needing to move. The commander who applies a rigid method regardless of circumstances has already lost the strategic initiative, because the enemy will learn the pattern and exploit it. The superior commander responds to conditions as they exist, not as a doctrine prescribes they should exist.
So the text is actually hostile to dogma, even its own.
Yes, and that is one of the reasons it has survived so long. A text that insists on the primacy of context over formula cannot be made obsolete by changing circumstances, because it never claimed that any particular set of circumstances was permanent. The fourth major category is the management of energy and timing. Sun Tzu distinguishes between the ordinary and the extraordinary in military action, arguing that direct force holds the enemy, while indirect force delivers the decisive blow. The metaphor he uses is striking. When a hawk strikes a bird and breaks its body in one blow, it is because the timing of the strike is perfect. The energy is released at precisely the right moment, neither too early to exhaust itself nor too late to find its target unprepared.
So Sun Tzu is describing strategy in the language of physics: force, timing, positioning, and release.
Yes, and that precision of language is one of the qualities that has made the text so portable across contexts. Its metaphors work in almost any competitive environment where resources must be concentrated and deployed with efficiency. The text also contains a sophisticated treatment of terrain and environment, arguing that the physical conditions of an engagement are not simply a backdrop, but an active element of strategy. The commander who uses terrain and weather to advantage fights with additional forces that cost nothing to recruit. And running through all of these categories is a consistent concern for the welfare of the state and its people. Sun Tzu repeatedly emphasizes that prolonged war is economically ruinous and socially destructive. A war that cannot be concluded quickly should not be begun.
So restraint is not simply a tactical preference, it is an ethical and economic argument.
Exactly, and that integration of military thinking with political economy is what elevates the text above a simple manual of battlefield tactics into something much more like a philosophy of power. The text was read and applied by Chinese military commanders for centuries, but its journey beyond its original context began in earnest in the 18th century, when a Jesuit missionary named Jean-Joseph Marie Amiot translated it into French. The French translation appeared in 1772, and some historians have argued that it influenced the strategic thinking of Napoleon Bonaparte, though the direct line of influence is a matter of ongoing historical discussion rather than settled fact.
So the text crossed linguistic and cultural boundaries more than 2,000 years after it was composed and continued to find new readers in entirely different strategic environments.
Yes, and the 20th century saw its influence expand into domains that Sun Tzu could not have imagined. During the Second World War, translations circulated among both Allied and Japanese military planners. Mao Zedong drew explicitly on Sun Tzu's principles in his writings on guerrilla strategy, in which a weaker force survives and eventually prevails by refusing to engage the stronger force on its own terms. General von Nguyen Giap, the Vietnamese commander who organized resistance first against French and then against American military power, spoke of Sun Tzu's influence on his thinking. The strategy of a smaller force avoiding decisive engagement, exhausting a larger opponent, and attacking only from positions of advantage is directly derived from principles the text articulates.
So the ancient Chinese principle of avoiding direct confrontation found direct application in some of the most significant military conflicts of the 20th century.
Yes, and in the 1980s and 90s, the text made its most dramatic cultural migration when it was adopted by the world of business and competitive strategy. Business schools began incorporating it into curricula, consultants cited it in presentations, executives carried it as a reference. The film Wall Street from 1987 made explicit reference to it as a guide for competitive thinking in financial markets.
So the text about war became a text about competition in any domain where advantage is sought.
Yes, and this expansion is not as strange as it might initially seem. The fundamental questions the text addresses: how to assess a situation accurately, how to manage your own resources while depleting the opponent's, how to act decisively at the right moment, and restrain yourself from acting prematurely, are not specific to armed conflicts. They apply wherever there is competition for limited advantage, which is to say, in almost every domain of organized human activity.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to engage directly with Sun Tzu's ideas, where would you invite them to begin?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Art of War by Sun Tzu itself.
So the primary source is the right starting point, not a commentary or a summary.
Precisely. The text is short enough to be read in a single sitting, and its directness rewards that immediacy. It presents a systematic analysis of warfare that emphasizes planning, intelligence, deception, and strategic positioning rather than direct confrontation. Over the centuries, it has influenced not only military commanders but political leaders, diplomats, and modern thinkers in management and competitive strategy, and reading it directly gives you access to why it continues to carry that influence.
Is there a particular translation you would recommend for someone approaching it for the first time?
There are many good translations available. The choice matters less than the decision to read it with attention rather than speed. The text rewards slowness and rereading more than almost anything else in the strategic literature. A translation that includes brief commentary on each chapter helps place the ideas in their historical context without overwhelming the reader with scholarly apparatus.
So reading it slowly, with the context we have discussed tonight in mind, changes what you find in it.
Yes, the text that appears as a collection of military maxims in a quick reading reveals itself, on reflection, as a coherent and radical philosophy of how to pursue any objective while minimizing the cost of pursuing it.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of The Art of War is both its extraordinary reach and the genuine complexity of how it has been received and applied. On the positive side, its influence on how military strategy is conceived and taught has been immense. The emphasis on intelligence over force, on preparation over improvisation, and on the psychological dimension of conflict anticipated ideas that Western military thought would take centuries to articulate with comparable clarity. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist whose own work on the nature of war became foundational in the 19th century, wrote from a very different cultural and philosophical tradition. Yet many of the tensions his work explores between the ideal and the real in war, between calculation and uncertainty, between political purpose and military means, are tensions Sun Tzu had already identified.
So two major traditions of strategic thought arrived independently at some of the same fundamental questions.
Yes, and that convergence across entirely different historical and cultural contexts suggests that the questions themselves are genuinely universal rather than specific to any one military tradition. But the critiques of the text's modern influence are also worth examining carefully. The adoption of Sun Tzu by the world of business and management has produced a large body of commentary that stretches his ideas well beyond the contexts in which they were originally meaningful. When the language of warfare, of enemies to be defeated, terrain to be controlled, and advantage to be seized, is applied to market competition or organizational management, something is both gained and lost. What is gained is a framework for thinking about competitive dynamics with clarity and economy. What is lost is the original ethical grounding of the text, which was concerned not only with victory but with the welfare of the state and its people and the cost of unnecessary conflict.
So the business appropriation of Sun Tzu often takes the tactics and discards the ethics embedded in the original argument.
Yes, and that selective reading is a form of distortion, one that Sun Tzu himself might have recognized as a failure to understand the full terrain of the problem. A further critique concerns the intellectual culture, in which the art of war is often consumed today, where it functions as a kind of portable authority, cited to lend strategic credibility to decisions that may have little to do with its actual content. The text has become, in some circles, more of a brand than a body of thought, something to be referenced rather than studied. That is precisely the kind of superficiality Sun Tzu's own framework would identify as a failure of preparation.
So invoking Sun Tzu without engaging with what he actually argued is itself a failure of the kind of self-knowledge the text demands.
Yes, that irony is precise and not lost on historians of ideas. The deeper legacy of the text lies in a set of questions it poses that remain entirely unresolved in the modern world. In an era of asymmetric conflict, where smaller and less conventionally powerful actors regularly confront states with vastly superior military resources, the Sun Tzu principle of avoiding direct engagement and attacking through indirect means has never been more practically relevant. In the domain of information and digital conflict, where influence operations, cyber attacks, and the manipulation of perception increasingly substitute for or precede physical confrontation, the idea that all conflict is fundamentally psychological finds new and disturbing expression.
So the concepts he developed for armies on an ancient steppe are now operating in modified form across digital networks and information environments.
Yes. The principle that deception is the foundation of all conflict and that the decisive battle takes place in the mind before it takes place in the field is, if anything, more true in the contemporary information environment than it was in 5th century China. And the core ethical argument of the art of war, that conflict should be resolved at the lowest possible cost, that unnecessary fighting represents a failure of intelligence and preparation, rather than a display of strength, is a principle that every era inherits and almost every era struggles to apply.
So the text survives not because the world has solved the problems it addresses, but because the world keeps rediscovering that it has not.
Exactly. A text that teaches the avoidance of unnecessary conflict endures precisely because unnecessary conflict never goes away.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the origins, the philosophy, and the enduring reach of Sun Tzu and the art of war.
To win without fighting is the ideal. To know why you cannot always achieve it is the beginning of wisdom.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.